perspective. Ooh. Oh, okay, sorry. I was going to act all this out. That was going to be a challenge. So women and girls are socialized to view themselves as objects meant for observation, and they internalize this perspective. They internalize the observer's perspective, or they self-objectify by taking a third-person point of view on their own experiences. And so, consequently, they experience the world not just as a subjective perceiver, but as an object perceived by others. In trying to understand the objectification, why women are objectified and why women objectify themselves, I've taken a social, psychological, and existential perspective, as I do with a lot of my research. And first and foremost, I look to the intellectual contributions of Ernest Becker, who in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, suggested that, that we can get some insight into understanding human motivation, or what makes people tick, by considering that human beings are physical, mortal creatures, and we're not necessarily thrilled about this. So, we share with other animals instincts aimed at self-preservation, but yet we're smart enough to know that inevitably our efforts will be in vain. And Becker suggested, in his words, that the irony of man's condition is that the deepest need is to be free of the anxiety of death and annihilation, but it's life itself which awakens it. So therefore, we shrink from being fully alive. Specifically, he argued that we kind of deal with this existential dilemma by imbuing ourselves into some kind of symbolic meaning system that that allows us to obtain a sense of symbolic value. He suggested that in doing this, we exchange a natural animal sense of our basic worth for a contrived symbolic one. So, in thinking about objectification of women, objectification is super physical with its focus on the body, but it's the body as an object. So in a sense, objectification can be understood as exchanging a natural animal sense of our basic worth for a contrived symbolic one. But as we'll see, this leads women to be less fully alive. But so, why women? Why does this apply to women? In the words of the feminist scholar Camille Paglia, every human being must wrestle with nature, but nature's burden falls more heavily on one sex. So evolutionary biologists have long recognized that women's and men's bodies are not equal in terms of their contribution to reproduction of the species. So as women, we menstruate monthly for our entire reproductive life, unless we happen to be carrying offspring in our womb for 9 months and then lactating afterwards, whereas the obligatory investment for men's bodies is much less, so maybe 15 minutes or so. Or if that. So from this perspective, this difference can be used as kind of a rationale for devaluing women and their connection to reproduction becomes an emblem of their inferiority. And we know this is true in the most literal sense when women are denied opportunities for leadership because their menstrual cycle might get in the way, right? In collaboration with my colleague and good friend, Tomi Ann Roberts, we've suggested that the association of women's bodies with reproduction can also play a role in objectification of women. As Simone de Beauvoir said, in women are incarnated disturbing mysteries of nature. In a woman dressed and adorned, nature is present but under restraint. And so from this perspective, this kind of expectation for women to be beautiful can be understood as a way of distancing them from their disturbing mysteries of nature. Okay, so now to share with you some of the ways that we've gone and tested some of these ideas. So in an experiment that we fondly refer to as the tampon drop experiment, we invited male and female college students to our laboratory in the psychology department and told them that they were going to be participating in a task with a partner. And then but the partner was actually secretly it's called a confederate. So it was part of the experiment, but the participant thought that they were another participant. So they're sitting there at the table, getting ready to do their thing, and the confederate goes into her backpack to take out a chapstick and accidentally drops something out of her bag. In one condition, it's a hair clip. In the other condition, it's a tampon. And then she goes about her business, puts it away, and we hypothesized that if, the reproductive connection is an emblem of inferiority, then she should be evaluated more negatively when she drops the tampon. And so we found this. So when the woman dropped the tampon, participants were asked, how competent do you think your partner will be on the next task? And they thought she'd be less competent than when she dropped the hair clip. They also liked her less. And then we had them go sit in a little waiting area for the next part of the study. The confederate takes the first seat. We measure whether the participant sits right next to them or one seat away, and found that when the participant or the confederate had dropped the tampon, that 53% of our participants sat with a chair in between them, kind of distancing from this creaturely woman. We also, in this study, wanted to test the hypothesis that objectification can also be a response to this association with kind of reproductive association. So we asked participants, how important is it for women to be beautiful? With a questionnaire with a couple of questions that kind of get at that. And what we found is that when this participant had when the confederate had dropped the tampon, that they thought it was more important for women to be beautiful in general, suggesting kind of this objectifying depiction of women in response to this association. We've also conducted studies looking at the consequences of focusing on a woman's appearance, and in terms of the way the woman is perceived. In this study, we ran in the run-up to the 2008 presidential election, when Sarah Palin was the running mate for John McCain against the Obama-Biden ticket. And as you might recall, there was a lot of commentary about her appearance, which is typical for women running for political office. And there was also a lot of discussion about her incompetence, which is typical for women running for office. And so my graduate student, Nathan Heflick, and I wanted to see whether there's a causal relationship between the focus on her appearance and the perception of her as less than competent. This hypothesis was not specific to Sarah Palin, but was relevant. But so we had also had participants evaluate another woman. So either they were assigned to evaluate Sarah Palin or Angelina Jolie. And what we asked them to do was either to write about the woman, either Palin or Jolie, or to write about the woman's appearance. So an appearance, a prime, to have them focus on the woman's appearance. And as we expected, when they focused on her appearance, in either case, Jolie or Palin, they perceived her to be less competent. Again, the same person, but just a different focus. She was evaluated differently. We also measured the humanness associated with the person. The idea here that we were kind of getting at is to the extent that somebody is perceived to be more like an object, that makes them less like a human. Yes?
And the glasses didn't help.
The what? Her glasses? No, they didn't. She was wearing, they looked at a picture and she was wearing glasses in both conditions, so. But so we found that either woman was rated as lower in humanness too, when the focus was on appearance. And then we actually measured, so this was before the election, we measured their voting intentions, and we found that the participants who were evaluating Palin, when they focused on her appearance, that they indicated that they were a lot less likely to vote for her than when they wrote about her without the focus on her appearance. Yeah, so this this study did get some media attention, and I had the very traumatic experience of being on Bill O'Reilly and talking about this study, which did not go well, to say the least. But yeah, no, I'm having like PTSD right now. Okay, so we've also conducted studies to show that these effects of focusing on appearance are specific to perceptions of women. And so in one of this series of studies, we had participants write about, at the time, Michelle Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama, or at the time, President Barack Obama. And again, with the same manipulation, we had them just write about the person or write about the person's appearance. And again, we found that when it was Michelle Obama and they focused on her appearance, they perceived her to be less competent. This did not occur for Barack Obama. We also measured perceptions of warmth and morality, which are characteristics associated with humanness, and found that both of these were reduced when they focused on a woman's appearance, but not on a man's. We've tested this same idea in some studies where, rather than having people focus on a person's appearance, we had them evaluate a target who's valued for her appearance. In this case, a fashion model. And then, in contrast, we had them evaluate a person who's valued for their mind, a graduate student. And we measured the association with objects in this study. And we have the way that we do this is we ask people how much certain characteristics are associated with objects, how much the same characteristics are associated with a person, in this case, either the fashion model or the graduate student, and then we look at the overlap. And what we found, which was what we hypothesized, is to the extent that the fashion model is objectified, that they would associate her more with objects. And then in this study, we also tested the novel hypothesis that to the extent that somebody is perceived to be more object-like, well, objects don't have feelings, right? So we asked them, how much do you think it would hurt if this person stubbed their toe, had a root canal, burnt their hand, and measured perceptions of pain associated with the person, and found that people perceived that the model would feel these things quite a bit less, which definitely has some chilling implications for sure. Okay, so in all these studies that I've been presenting, we used male and female participants, and we get these effects across both genders, but clearly there is a special dynamic underlying men's attraction to women. So in these next studies that I want to mention, we found that under certain conditions, men prefer objectified depictions of women. And in these studies, we used a manipulation that we call it a mortality salience manipulation. So kind of going back to the ideas, Ernest Becker's denial of death that I kind of started out with, the idea is to the extent that men are reminded of their physical mortal nature, that this should be threatening to them, and then, from the perspective I presented, that this should make them prefer women who are kind of depicted as more objectified. And so we've tested that, so they'd be rendered more desirable to the extent that they are objectified. We have done this in a couple studies. In one study, we looked at, these are real advertisements where women are kind of literally conjoined with an object, in this case, a Budweiser bottle. And we found that when men were primed with their mortality reminder, that they found the woman more attractive than when they weren't kind of under this threat. We didn't get the same response at all when we photoshopped our own advertisement where they're separated. We also conducted a study where we actually asked men how attractive they found mannequins. So they're like literally literal objects, so decapitated and kind of bionic women. And again, under the condition where they're primed with this kind of existential threat, they find the mannequins to be more attractive, and we don't get these same results when they evaluate the actual human form of the woman. Okay. So far in this presentation, I've been talking about objectification of women, but I also want to kind of go back to the self-objectification and share with you some of the work we've done here. Okay, so along the same lines as some of the research that I presented, showing that when people are reminded of women's connection to reproduction, that they objectify women more, we've conducted studies looking at women's own self-objectification. And in these couple of studies, we again use that mortality salience manipulation. So we asked some women to think about the fact that they're mortal creatures and compared this to a control condition where they thought about, we usually use something aversive but not death-related, like experiencing pain. And we hypothesized that under these conditions, when women are reminded of their mortality and when they're kind of reminded of their association with reproduction, that they would objectify themselves more. So in one study, we had women look at either a picture of a woman as pregnant or the same woman as not pregnant, and then expose them to the mortality salience manipulation. And we found that only when the woman was depicted, when they were reminded of women's role in pregnancy, did the mortality prime lead them to feel like it was more important to look good? And then in another study, we did a very similar paradigm with, in this case, exposed women to a picture of a woman nursing versus bottle feeding her baby. And we measured, again, this kind of literal objectification. So we asked women about their association with objects by, again, having them kind of say how much these characteristics describe objects, how much these characteristics describe themselves, and we looked at the overlap. And so we found, just like in the finding that when men were threatened, they preferred objectified depictions of women more. When women were under these same conditions, they objectified themselves more. But, so, we could think of self-objectification as a psychological defense, but it has consequences. In one kind of a classic study looking at this that this is not my study, but Tommy Ann Roberts, who I've collaborated with quite a bit, did with her colleagues. What they did in this study is, under the guise of a marketing study, they had men and women try on either a swimsuit or a sweater. And they did this in a private dressing room with a full-length mirror. And then what they found is that when women tried on the swimsuit, that they had increased body shame, but the men did not. They also restrained their eating. There was a taste test portion of the study, and so women ate less when they were in the bathing suit, and men did not. But then one of the kind of findings I want to focus on more is the idea is that to the extent that women are self-objectifying, they're kind of, this idea that you're stepping outside of yourself, looking at yourself from an external perspective, and this is really cognitively distracting. So what Fredrickson and Roberts, Nolan, what they did is they had the participants do some math problems. And sure enough, women were not very good at math when they were wearing a bathing suit, whereas men did just fine. So again, the idea is that this interferes with the ability to think straight. Along these same lines, as showing that cognitive performance is hindered, my graduate students and I, Roxanne, who's sitting right there in the front, were interested in this idea, is that to the extent that women are somewhat focused on how their body looks, this leaves less resources for kind of figuring out how your body feels. And so we were interested in this phenomenon that you have probably all observed, where it's it's a really cold night and you go out and you see women who are out wearing very little clothing and they don't appear to be cold. And so we were interested in testing whether self-objectification can be the mechanism that explains this. And so what the graduate students, spearheaded by Roxanne, did is they went out to Ybor City on from like 9:30 to 12:30 in the morning on 5 of the coldest nights of the year, February 20, right before the pandemic started. And despite what people in other parts of the country who may be watching this think, it does get really cold. We have really cold nights here. And plus you got the humidity, right? So it was cold. It was like 45 degrees. And they stopped people on the street and they gave them a brief questionnaire which asked them a couple of questions about how focused they were on their appearance, so how much they were self-objectifying. They were also asked how cold they felt. We also asked, we measured we asked them to report how many drinks they had so we can control for that kind of confound. And then they asked to take a picture of them. And so here are some examples. And then each picture was coded for how much skin was exposed. And what you would expect is that in general, I mean, of course, people vary, but in general, the more skin that's exposed, the colder you should feel. And that's what we found for women who were low in self-objectification. But women who were high in self-objectification, there was absolutely no relationship between how much clothing they were wearing and how cold they felt, suggesting that that they were kind of disconnected from the things that they should feel. They should have been cold, but didn't know that they were cold. We also have another study that was actually Roxanne's master's thesis. And in this study, she was interested in looking at the effects of editing a selfie for posting on social media, which is something that's super common today. And in particular, she was interested in what are the implications of editing a picture of yourself for kind of a clear sense of who you are. The hypothesis was that to the extent that you can kind of change the way you look and kind of put it out there, that this would undermine a clear self-concept. And so she exposed participants to one of two social media Instagram profiles, one which was very appearance focused and one which was not at all, a nature profile, so with pictures like this or that, and found, as you might expect, when women looked at this, attractive woman on Instagram, and then, so what we did is we took their picture and said that we'd love to post it on our lab's new Instagram, on our story, and would they be willing to let us do it, and then also that they might want to edit their picture before we post it, and we kind of gave them some editing software and a little tutorial. What we found, kind of not surprisingly, is that women spent more time editing their photo when they had looked at the attractive woman's Instagram, but then kind of what are more novel and maybe concerning finding is that the more time they spent editing their photo for posting, the less clear sense of self they had. We measured something called self-concept clarity, and this went down. Okay, so we've seen some consequences, and there are lots more, but we saw evidence of kind of negative emotions in terms of body shame and inhibited behavior, eating less for the women, a less clear self-concept, and as a result of this cognitive distraction associated with self-objectification, we also found diminished cognitive performance and less awareness of internal bodily states in the study I presented with, feeling cold. And then there is some other research, and kind of just intuitively, it makes a lot of sense to the extent that you're focused on yourself from an external perspective, that this would undermine a sense of flow, which is the ability to immerse oneself in some kind of engaging task or creative task. So clearly, this has a lot of relevance to kind of artistic endeavors. So, now kind of applying this to Lee Miller, I'm not sure, I think some people saw the exhibit before, some people haven't. I'm not sure how much you know about Lee Miller, but I'll assume you know the bullet points, that she was a model turned photographer turned World War II war correspondent and photojournalist. Being valued for her appearance did not just start for Lee Miller with her modeling career. And if you know the story, the way that started, or it was that she was standing on the street in Manhattan, and there was an oncoming truck that was going to hit her, and a man like swooped her out of the way and rescued her, and he happened to be Condé Nast, the editor of Vogue magazine. And he was so taken by her beauty that he put her on the cover of Vogue at age 19. But that, for Lee Miller, was not the start of her, her time in front of the camera. Lee Miller's father, Theodore Miller, was a amateur photographer, and he would use Lee as the subject of his photo shoots. So they were not all kind of your typical family pictures. Rather, they were artistic photos with Lee, who was Elizabeth at the time, she became Lee later, with her posing, and often she was posing nude, and not just as a child, into adulthood, and sometimes with a friend to join as well. Another. For her father? Huh? She was posing nude with a friend for her father? Correct. That was as a teenager. And then another kind of defining experience and extremely tragic experience was that Lee Miller was raped at age 7 by a family friend, and wound up getting gonorrhea from that at age 7, and that was pre-penicillin, and so the treatments were super invasive and took a long time, and you can imagine that was super traumatic for anyone, but especially a 7-year-old. And so her family took the approach of kind of minimizing the experience, and they actually sought help from a psychiatrist, which was pretty rare at the time, and the psychiatrist gave them the advice to convey to Elizabeth that sex should not be associated with any deep feelings, and kind of to separate those two things. And very likely, not coincidentally, just a few months after that were the first kind of known photos of Lee posing, or Elizabeth posing nude for a photograph that her father took. She is 8 years old, standing outside her house in Poughkeepsie, New York, with kind of snow on the ground and wearing nothing but her bedroom slippers. So these experiences were likely to contribute to a more than typical experience of objectification and self-objectification. And from what I've read about Lee Miller's relationship with her body, is it was very, very detached. And let's just say that she would be very likely to report feeling cold no matter how cold it was outside. I think it's very, very fitting in the biography of on Lee Miller by Carolyn Burke, she's in talking about, so Theodore would take the photos, and then Elizabeth would help him in the darkroom develop the photos. And what she said about Lee's experiences, Lee would have experienced the sensation of seeing double, herself as aesthetic subject, her body as object of scrutiny for the man in whose eyes she saw herself mirrored. This meant experiencing not her inner states, but the camera's objectification. So again, we can see this kind of insight into understanding Lee Miller as having a very externally focused perspective on the body, and kind of perhaps magnified by being through the lens of the camera. And this, I just found this, and I'm not sure how relevant it is, but it's interesting nonetheless. So when Lee Miller first moved to New York, she did some stock photos by the famous American photographer Edward Streichen. And then, so she took these photos, and then a couple years later, this advertisement from Kotex came out. And so Kotex, the menstrual pad company, and this is actually the first advertisement for menstrual products that featured a real person. And this was like, the family was up in arms, and they were really, really kind of upset by this, because this was so disturbing to make this association. Again, it was not something that Lee Miller had any role in, but it does somehow seem kind of related to what we've been talking about here. So I thought I would share that. I think it is a fair assumption that that Lee Miller had trouble kind of perhaps integrating the different aspects of herself. She describes in a letter to a lover her life as a water-soaked jigsaw puzzle, drunken bits that don't match in shape or design, kind of maybe mapping back onto our self-concept clarity finding. And the men in her life, starting with her father, clearly valued Lee for her beauty. Picasso painted Lee Miller 6 times. This is an example. Man Ray, her associate and lover for many years, photographed her hundreds of times. And a Parisian designer even designed a champagne glass in the shape of Lee Miller's breasts, which rumor had were the most beautiful breasts in all of Paris. So clearly, she was valued for her beauty, perhaps at the expense of her humanness. This is even perhaps more clear, and this is a metronome created by Man Ray that after their breakup with Lee Miller's eye, and it's called Object of Destruction. And then kind of fittingly, Lee Miller was cast in Jean Cocteau's film Blood of a Poet to play a statue. So that was her role in film, was to play the part of, and again, a literal object. I love, love, love this quote. This is like, so I would rather take a picture than be one. So Lee Miller kind of at some point decided that she wanted to kind of switch things around, and she was essentially saying that I want to be kind of a subjective perceiver of experiences, and I want to be aware of my body and have self-concept clarity and engage in this flow experience. I think to some extent, breaking boundaries for women requires rising up against these dynamic and oppressive forces of objectification. And this is can occur both by rejecting objectification by others, which, it seems like to some extent that Lee Miller did this later in her life after the war, when she wore combat boots and trousers, despite that being like not at all fashionable as it might be now, but more primarily by rejecting this self-objectification. If you saw the exhibit, you probably saw some photographs that Lee Miller took of Picasso and Dali, again, kind of flipping the role around and no longer being the picture, but being the one taking one. And I just couldn't do a Lee Miller, kind of consider Lee Miller without at least kind of putting up this iconic photo of Lee Miller. This is in Hitler's bathtub on the day that he committed suicide, and she and her colleague Dave Sherman kind of found his apartment in Munich and went inside, and he took the picture, she staged the picture. She wiped her dirty boots because she had just come from concentration camp on the bath mat. And so and maybe people have more ideas that you can chat about after about kind of analyzing this picture, but clearly mortality is salient here. This is, after coming from the concentration camps and Hitler just committed suicide. And there are symbolic components with this picture of Hitler that was in his frame picture of himself that was in his apartment that they put there, and the kind of the female nude. But if you look at Lee in this photo, it is not really an objectified depiction. It's a real body with dirt and grime to boot. And so to kind of quote the art critic John Berger, he said, to be naked is to be oneself, to be nude is to be naked for others and not just recognized as oneself. So when I look at this photo, it appears to be more that Lee Miller is naked in the tub rather than a nude for other people's observation. But okay, so with my art, I think, and kind of reflecting on that as I've been doing this, I can see a trajectory from more objectified depictions, and you saw a lot of my art through this presentation, and there's lots more. But this is what I've been working on most recently, and when I paint, I am in the role of a subjective perceiver, and I am experiencing flow. And then in the series that I've been doing now, when I do compare myself to standards, they're standards for women who are kind of changing the world. And one of my goals with this research has been to kind of expand my boundaries beyond an academic audience to kind of communicate more broadly. And I had this crazy experience recently where I submitted this photo to the Facebook group Pantsuit Nation, and I didn't even know they were going to post it, and I actually got got an email from a former graduate student in England. He's like, I think I just saw you on Pantsuit Nation. And then within minutes, it blew up and it went viral. And within 5 hours, I had 42,000 likes and 2,000 comments. And the amazing thing was that every one of those comments was nice. And like, they were like, people were, I mean, which is, people were moved. And they were like, I mean, I was kind of connecting with this audience of people who were also moved by like these women who are changing the world. In addition, what I've been doing is so it's actually my friend Diana, who wasn't able to make it, but I told her I would give her a shout out because she's watching it. It was her idea. She said, she's like, we got to do something, to get your art out there more. And she came up with this whole T-shirt idea. And so the idea is that, not everybody is in the market for original art, but by like putting these images of women who I think a lot of people are excited about on the T-shirts, it's again allowed me to kind of connect with a much broader audience, and it's been really, really fun. Here's just like, yeah, Mona's daughter's here. And these are just some of the people who I know who sent me pictures. So this has been really, really fun. But so I think just like Lee Miller, the women I paint are breaking boundaries. And I think to some extent, or it feels like going back and forth between academic researcher to artist and back again, it makes me feel like I'm breaking boundaries as well. Thank you. Okay, right in the back in the white shirt. Okay.
No, thank you. Well, it's a very impressive presentation. Your orientation involves changing the world. So it's kind of an obvious question. How does your study of objectification inform the nature versus nurture conversation? Yes.
It's tricky in terms, like, I would say that we're not able to pinpoint that with our studies. We are tapping into what we'd argue is kind of part of the threat and the problem, but it doesn't get at, just because we show that people are threatened by a reminder of mortality or this kind of crime, it doesn't really allow us to pinpoint where that comes from. So I would have to say, I don't think we can, as a result of the studies that I presented or any of the studies I've done, be able to get at the underlying cause. But what we're showing is a psychological kind of motivation or response to the kind of crimes that we're looking at, whether it's a reminder of mortality or focusing on a woman's appearance. But so I will have to say it does not. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, based on her trauma, being raped at 7, her dad taking pictures of her, that as an adult, she turned the tables and used her beauty to essentially seduce the men that she wanted to sleep with.
Well, wait, so what's the question is
right.
that...
Do you think that her trauma made it so that she realized I have the power and I can pick and choose who I want to sleep with?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think what I am focusing on is her kind of relationship with her body and being able to maybe use it in a more detached manner. And so that might play a role in those kind of dynamics. But the other thing about self-objectifying, and this is something I didn't really kind of get into in the talk, is that clearly there are benefits as well. There, by it, for women, focusing on their appearance, that there are kind of social and economic benefits to kind of looking your best. And so we can kind of examine the consequences associated with self-objectification, and they're there and they're real, but it also, there is clearly a motivation that makes a lot of kind of smart sense to kind of use or to try to look your best because there are gains associated with that. So maybe that provides like a little.
She was cunning as to who she slept with.
I don't know if she was. I can't answer that question at all. Go ahead.
I'm curious if you've done any studies or read any studies about how the objectification kind of varies from country to country or culture to culture. Like thinking about, and maybe that's a little bit off the nurture versus nature, but like thinking about Germany or Europe where the whole family goes to the spa, naked together, and like nudity and body image is just viewed differently. And then flip the script and look at Afghanistan where they try to de-objectify women by women workers maybe are objectified. I mean, I'm sorry, I throw a lot at you. But
No. I mean, and clearly there are cultural differences in the way that it's kind of manifested and expectations for women's bodies and all different standards for like the way women are expected to look, and some standards may seem odd from one culture to another. I guess what we are interested in is like kind of whatever those standards are, this kind of stepping outside the self and reflecting on one's appearance. But yeah, I would imagine that there are cultural differences in how much women do that across, across different cultures. So, for sure. Go ahead.
Hi, I'll preface this by saying I haven't seen the exhibit yet,
Okay.
but I wonder if you might have any insight into the fact that recently there's been a rediscovery of Artemisia gentileschi, and in the terms of like women defying the boundaries of Renaissance, the Baroque period. I wonder if you have any insight into maybe a connection with her and her background and so forth with Lee Miller. Do you qualify to?
Yeah. I'm gonna have to take a pass on that. I don't think I know enough to.
Because there's been like a lot of rediscovery of her, and then I thought that maybe with certain factors of experiences in her
Yeah.
life and with Lee Miller, that maybe.
That sounds really interesting, but I don't know
I'll
enough
give it a shot.
to
But I
comment.
do agree with this woman. I think that it is very cultural, because when you look at calendars of women of the Baltic, they're all hanging out.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Yeah, I mean, and that I think that
that may be a more germane question. Do you think that in this country it's not organic? It's really what Madison Avenue has done. Women are, and it's awful.
it's really it absolutely Madison Avenue, and then like power motives and to sell products. That's all there, and so when I say we can't get at what the underlying cause is, so we don't conduct these studies in a vacuum or a test tube. There's all sorts of influences. What we can just show is kind of the psychological response to the conditions that we're looking at, but we can't separate it from, or we can't isolate it from all those other kind of cultural influences.
Like,
So,
thank you.
yeah.
I'm gonna go to that nature and nurture conversation. Just watching the presentation and you doing the tampon. I think, nature created male and female bodies, but nurture has created these reactions.
Mm.
If you drop a tampon, then you're incontinent. Hide your stuff. So I think what this
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hard, clearly, we've got, kind of a lot of things playing a role, and it's hard to isolate that, and,
Yeah, I don't think it's nice. I think it's you embed your own
yeah.
perspective on it and walk away.
I'm gonna